Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to the Way of Being podcast. My name is Luke Bricker, and I'm excited to have the very first guest on the Way of Being podcast today. Before I give him an introduction, though, I would like to just sort of name a couple things here. Yes, we have shifted from, and by we, I mean I, have shifted from Spiritual Nomad to the Way of Being. So if you have this podcast in your library and you're like, where did the Way of Being come from? How did I start subscribing and following that podcast? Well, it was the Spiritual Nomad podcast for the past 6 years. And in January 1st, everything switched to the Way of Being because it's just simply more accurate for who I am, where I'm at, and the work that I do now in the world. It just fits a lot better. That name came to me like a year and a half ago. I've been sitting on it. Finally decided just to do it this year in 2023. So a lot of fun stuff that's going to be rolling out, like this interview with Ellis. One more thing before we jump in is in 2023, I'm really focusing on making myself available for spiritual companionship, spiritual direction. As many of you know, I've been an ordained minister for years and walking with people along their spiritual unfoldment. And so I have one-on-one spiritual companionship available. It's contribution, not cost. So it's a part of our 501c3 nonprofit organization as a service. And so whatever people feel in their hearts to contribute, that's open and available for them. But there is no real set cost. So if you are someone who needs someone to walk with on the path of awakening, click the link somewhere around here. And I set up just a little, it's on a platform like a course or a workshop, but it's really just me for 50 minutes, just sort of giving you an overview of what spiritual companionship is, who I am, how I serve, and what all of this could be for you in your life. So watch that, listen to it, whatever there's MP3 too. And if it resonates with you, if it's something that's calling to you, something you feel like you need in your life, I want to make myself available to you. So somewhere around this podcast or YouTube video, click the link and it'll take you to my website and we can connect for spiritual companionship. And without further ado, let me introduce to you today's guest on the podcast. I want to introduce to you Ellis Anthony Peters. Ellis is a spiritual content creator and entrepreneur. He is the creator of the Spiritual Changemakers podcast, and he owns a spiritual marketing company in which he helps spiritual business owners grow their following ethically. Love that part. He is also a meditation teacher and advocate of interspirituality. Now, friends, welcome Ellis to the Way of Being podcast. Welcome to the Way of Being, my friend.
Thanks.
So this is kind of a really cool moment for me because this is my first guest on this podcast with the new name. So for years, 6 years ago, I started the Spiritual Nomad podcast. That was just evidence of where I was at the time. And about a year and a half ago, this name, The Way of Being, came to me. It felt a little bit more in tune with who I was, but I'd already sort of created this caricature of a spiritual nomad. And, I had branding and such around that. And I was going to start this as a podcast for the church that we'd started and decided not to. And then just decided to just rebrand this whole thing to be more in tune because I really didn't want to do the spiritual nomad thing anymore. So it's been fun watching your Instagram feed and seeing how that lines up so wonderfully with the heart behind the new name. So it makes sense that you would be the first guest with this name of the Way of Being. So thank you for joining me, and want to have a good conversation about where my path has taken me, which is that of interspirituality, and want to learn a little bit more about how you got to this place of interspirituality. And so we'll kind of just break it down a little bit for people. If people have been listening to this podcast for any period of time, that's really been the heart and the essence of this for quite some time. So I think people will understand some of the fundamentals of that. But would love to have you maybe just give an overview of interspirituality from your perspective. What are some of the elements that led you to that? And yeah, let's just start with that. So,
Yeah.
little of your own introduction here.
Yeah. So I think to give some context to interspirituality, I feel like it makes sense to kind of describe my path. And I think that might help if someone hasn't heard of that term, like help them understand how they may uh, agree with that same perspective or identity of interspirituality. So for me, I grew up going to Catholic schools my whole life, and really throughout that whole time, up until I was like 12 or so, it was not really spiritual for me. It was just kind of like this is where I go to school, we go to church, but church was never a spiritual experience for me. It was kind of just following what the teachers were telling me to do, basically. Um, but I did, at like an early age, have a lot of interest in certain spiritual figures within the Christian tradition, like Saint Francis of Assisi. It's a big one for so many people. But for myself too, hearing the stories of his life and his connection with animals and nature was just easy to connect with him. And then I also it was kind of interesting. I did this like biography on this saint. His name is Saint Anthony of the Desert, and he was just, from what I remember, I haven't researched much about him since then, but it was kind of like interesting to me. He was just roaming around in the desert, had super long hair, and was just living this very mystical path. So there were a few figures in that early upbringing that interest me, but basically around like 13 or 14, I kind of just decided that that was no longer the right path for me. And then I got into just exploring plant medicine and meditation around that time. And I think around that time, when I started having some experiences with plant medicine, with meditation, I like really started to have spiritual experiences where I connected with who I was beyond my mind, beyond my thoughts, really. And that was where everything opened up for me, where I realized that there was something you could actually experience that is related to these religious traditions. It's not just dogma, there's like something deeper. And so, because of that, I got really into Buddhism at first. I worked with a Zen teacher when I was living in Chicago for like 2 years, and it was Zazen, like Soto Zen centered tradition. So, I got really into that Buddhist path and specifically meditation for a few years. And that was really beautiful, but I felt like it was a little bit dry for me. It was very black and white. Like, yeah, yeah, for sure. And so, and even from like the Christian background where there's prayer and there's a belief in a relationship aspect between the soul and God to a certain extent. Where Zen was with Zen, it was very much just sit down, be quiet, notice the present moment, be with whatever it is, and that will give you enlightenment, basically. And it's powerful, but it wasn't. Yeah, there wasn't like the color and emotion that I felt was really important. So that led me to go into the more like Hindu and yoga path, which has been like my main spiritual practice has been kind of like classical yoga, the eight limbed path. Um, and that was for me, had those meditative aspects that Buddhism had and the really great philosophy that Buddhism had, but it also had that devotional, that emotional and colorful side that I loved about the Christian tradition. And really, where I'm at now today is like I consider myself a spiritual person. I don't consider myself a religious person. But I like that term, the term interspirituality, because to me, my spiritual practice, my spiritual outlook is not, it doesn't have any hard feelings towards religions. Like, I think religious paths are beautiful and powerful, but I think that there's so many people, myself included, that could never fully commit to, like, this is just what I'm following and that's it. I'm open to anything that is going to help me connect with God. So whatever it is, whether it be plants, whether it be art, or whether it be a spiritual tradition or religious tradition, I'm open to that. And that's kind of what I view interspirituality as, is there's a lot of different definitions to it, but for me I view it as practicing things from multiple traditions at the same time. So that's kind of a brief explanation of my story and how I've come to interspirituality.
Yeah, I'm curious on that too. Not to uh, cut you off too quickly, but one thing that I really appreciate about your Instagram and why I feel like I really connect with you, and I think in the email I said I feel like we have some similar values because
Mm.
um, for me, coming from I was a pastor's kid. I grew up in the church, went to school to be in ministry, was preaching on stage at really young ages, and then went through a deconstruction of faith. That's kind of the buzzword,
Mm-hmm.
um, which, whatever. Um, a lot of times people come on the backside of that, especially in Christianity, being in the West, hurt from it and,
Mm-hmm.
kind of crushed by the institution. And therefore we become, you know, uh, only seeing doctrine through one particular strict worldview that we are rejecting, and we take that one little thread as the whole quilt and just push the whole thing away. And so I've
Mm-hmm.
really incorporated elements of Christianity back in. What I loved, one of your posts was like about understanding the deeper traditions of all of these faiths that shape us, and honoring those traditions.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you speak a little bit maybe to how interspirituality? Because at the end of the day, we're all kind of picking and choosing. Like that's what a guy cornered me in a coffee shop last month and was like, "You're just picking and choosing. You're cherry picking." I'm like, Jesus cherry picked, the Psalms. I
It's
mean,
true.
it's we all do that. We are all doing
Mm-hmm.
that, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But one thing that I think is important about what you're saying is that um, it isn't necessarily just this hodgepodge of just because what happens in New Age, and I know you're in San Diego too, and it's very popular around here to just sort of take all of these things that work for you and craft your own, which I think has its place, but sometimes at the expense of just like throwing the baby out with the bathwater of all of the other elements of that tradition. You don't really honor that tradition. You're just sort of robbing what you want from it.
Yeah.
So maybe can you speak a little bit your journey of coming to a place of not being you know angry with or whatever, and really honoring the traditions and drinking deeply from them? Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally does. It's something that I think about a lot on my own spiritual journey. Um, I think that the way that I would start answering this is that everyone's different. So I think the reason so many people struggle with religion is because people claim to know what's best for them, for another person. And I think ultimately it is up to everyone to choose what's bringing them to God. So if for someone that means just following a Christian path or just being a Buddhist, awesome. If that's for someone else, maybe it could look like, yeah, like a lot of people here in San Diego who don't really deeply dive into any specific tradition and understand it in a deep way, but just take very, simple things. I think that's okay too. Like I said, I don't want to claim to know what's best for anyone, but I think for me, yeah, for me, what I've found is that when you can go deeper and study a tradition, beyond just those surface level understandings, you can understand why they've set up the system and the tradition and in the dogma, even in the way that they have. And for instance, with yoga, for instance, the eight limbs of yoga, um, there are specific. It's really, to me, kind of a science. Some people will say it's just straight up a science. I don't think it's straight up a science in the way we think of the word science today, but it is very scientific. And a lot of people who don't study it in a deeper way might think all there is to it is just like, oh, just do some breath work and do your yoga postures, and that's kind of all there is to it. But in reality, it goes really deep into the psychology of the mind and why you would want to avoid negative self-talk towards yourself or negative thoughts towards another person, why you would want to practice non-attachment, why you want to um, bring your senses in, like the importance of bringing yourself inward. And it really explains these things in detail to help you get to the place of being able to meditate deeply, and to be, eventually the goal is to connect with yourself as consciousness itself. And so I think the thing for me with your question is like, sometimes if people just take that new age approach, that really traditional new age approach where there's not much exploration deeply into any of these traditions, we miss out on the deeper teachings of the tradition that are really helpful for our own spiritual growth. So that's to me that's why I personally, although I don't wouldn't identify myself as a Hindu, why I still like to really kind of go deep into that specific tradition and that specific practice for my own sense of spirituality, because I think it helps just my own spiritual growth to have the deeper understanding of the tradition.
Yeah. And that tradition, I mean, deep diving into Hinduism is really what helped me revisit my own native tradition. And I think that's
Mm.
what interspirituality can do for us is it when we look at the truths within multiple understandings of connecting to the infinite, we're able to understand what we've been handed with a whole new lens and a whole new level of clarity.
Hmm.
Because that's, growing up in deep in a charismatic Christian tradition, you know, when I began to see some of the Eastern traditions and some of the truths of Buddhism and Hinduism and really Taoism, man, you start reading that and you're like, dude, like Lao Tzu is like pre Jesus consciousness for sure. Like they were on functioning on the same
Yeah.
wavelength, and it's like then whenever I revisit the Gospels, I'm like, oh, I totally see now, what's happening here. And that's, what I love about people coming to this truth of interspirituality is it doesn't make us it doesn't imply that we're alienating anything. It's that we're including it all. It is that
Hmm.
everything belongs, everything has a place. It's layers being revealed to the depth of the truth that is above all of this stuff, Um, but I'm curious, when you grew up through the Catholic, branch of Christianity and St. Francis of Assisi, and I mean, Anthony, I mean, we get our whole monastic tradition from him, and St. Anthony, and he's the, you know, OG of the Desert Fathers, and but I'm curious that transition then. Um, like was there stuff to work through in terms of the because there's still the foundational Western idea of God and self and separation and things, and how
Mm.
did that move from separation to union, and did Buddhism, just the presence, how much did that play a piece in all that of connection? Man, I hope this
Yeah.
landscaper
I
in the background is not absolutely ruining the audio, but it's all good.
can,
uh, does
I
that
don't
make
hear
yeah?
it much,
Okay.
so I think
He's
it's,
like
yeah.
right outside my door.
but hey, everything belongs, right? So
Yeah. There you go. Um, yeah, so I think really the big thing that I learned and started to value quickly from the more dharmic traditions was the emphasis on experience. And for me growing up in the Catholic tradition, it was very much here's just what you do, and if you do these things, God will help you, basically. There was never even there. Like I was talking to my brother a few months ago when he was, or I guess a month ago over Christmas, and I was saying like how cool it would have been to have a mystical priest because I never even had an experience with a priest or a religious teacher who was even able to explain that idea of God in a metaphysical way. Like we never even really explored that in terms of how it could be thought of in metaphor in a metaphysical perspective. It was just here's what you do, and God's gonna keep you from going to hell or gonna bring you to heaven. And there was no emphasis on connecting with God through spiritual practice. There wasn't like a big emphasis on that. Maybe there was a little bit, but it wasn't, that wasn't the focus. It was more so like following the dogma and just kind of going about your life. And then when I got to Buddhism, I would say the first thing for me was again the plant medicine experiences showed me deeper layers of who I was. And then Buddhism really emphasized the importance of being able to, experience enlightenment or reach enlightenment through meditation. So there was this emphasis really shifting from the dogma of the tradition, which obviously, for people who are informed of the Christian tradition, it's not just dogma. There's a lot of mystical aspects to it that I understand now. But when I was moving from my understanding of the tradition to this experiential focus, I was like, okay, this makes sense because this to me relates or it's similar to my experience and transformation from plant medicine and even art. Like I've played guitar my whole life, and so playing music on stage, I would feel like I would have mystical experiences to a certain extent. And so this focus on like just meditate and you can experience what this ultimate reality is for yourself, and then you decide for yourself what it is. That to me was, I would say, the big shift in my understanding of like spirituality and God. And I would say that it wasn't until I started exploring the Hindu traditions more deeply that I started to be able to reconcile Christian philosophies with dharmic experiential understandings of the divine or enlightenment. So I would say like now my personal belief right now is that I have a non-dual understanding that in essence everything is God, or whatever word someone wants to use. But I don't think it's as simple as just saying like that, just saying everything's God. I think it's really simple in one way, but it's also really complex that we also live on Earth and we clearly have a separate identity here, and we have a dualistic world, and that's also, I don't view that as completely unreal. Like, the Advaita school of Vedanta is very much, this is all Maya, it's all not real. I don't really have that perspective, but I do kind of have a non-dual perspective on spirituality.
yeah, yeah, and because that's the non-dual Christianity is, I guess, how you would come. That's the truth that I came to eventually. It took me a long time to really even embrace the word of Christianity at all again. I was pretty off put by that, but understanding it from a non-dual perspective, authors like Richard Rohr were fundamental back in the day and things of that nature. But
Yeah.
speaking on this, I think plant medicine definitely can help people open up to that that non-dual reality. It seems like that was a huge thing even in the counterculture, even today with the psychedelic renaissance, that people are seeing the merging of who they are, who they think they are, with the truth of everything around them, and
Yeah.
it's opening up a lot of things for a lot of people. But you know, I'm curious your perspective on some of the psychedelic renaissance as well, because it sounds like, listening to your story, that that's really what opened you up to the place that you're at. But it's, it, this is just me maybe projecting, but it's kind of like the Alan Watts, after you get the message, hang up the phone sort of thing.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so I'm curious, like with your plant medicine experience, what, like, was it mushrooms or was it
Hmm.
ayahuasca? And then what was your revelation from that? And then yeah, how did that begin to bring some formation?
Yeah. So yeah, it started. My first experience was with mushrooms. I did LSD, um, mainly just LSD and mushrooms. But the most important one was my first experience with mushrooms because it opened me up to really similar experiences that I've had later through meditation, where it's just like a direct knowing, almost like
Mm.
of a waking up from a dream, really. It's funny. I was just bringing up the Advaita Vedanta that everything is an illusion, and when we realize the illusion, it's like waking up from a dream. So I guess I haven't totally ruled out that perspective. I just don't think it's the healthiest,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, for going about our daily lives. But I just bring that up because it is kind of a similar feeling that I've had with mushrooms, or I did have with mushrooms, where it was just like an instant kind of remembering or knowing. And then, yeah, with LSD, it was similar experiences. But now, yeah, I definitely think that that can only take you so far. I think the great thing with plants is I think they're great to utilize to kind of like reset if we're like lost and these traditional things aren't helping us, like our own spiritual practices aren't helping us, and we're maybe feeling confused, we're not feeling compassion, we're feeling lost. Like they can be great to kind of like reset, and they can. I was telling my friend, I feel like they teach us spiritual lessons without using words,
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
and a lot of other ways of learning in spirituality do involve words from teachers and traditions and books, and sometimes that's so mental. We're so in our head, we're thinking about how to be more loving, who we are. The plants can just remind us of the importance of just how to stop thinking and just realize it. But I do think that, to me, the perfect combo is once you've had those experiences, then it's about exploring how to connect to that state without them, without the plants or whatever. And
Yeah.
to me, that's why it's really helpful to have develop a spiritual practice, explore a spiritual tradition, because what I found was that they, especially Buddhism and Hindu traditions, really explained what I experienced really well.
Mm.
And then I realized, well, they explain steps and how to connect to that state consistently, and the importance of that. And I think that was for me when I was like 18, to understand that was really mind blowing.
Mm.
So that's kind of my take on it, is that I think they're powerful. I think that they should be used in combination with consistent spiritual practice and having spiritual frameworks of understanding.
Yeah.
And I think that also, I've never struggled with this, but I do know there's a lot of people who use them to escape also. And there's not an intention of, I need to connect with myself spiritually here. It's more like, I have these mental issues that I don't know how to deal with, and I'm just going to go to this plant medicine ceremony to basically just get high.
Yeah. And
So
they do it again and again and again.
again,
It's
yeah,
like, what, yeah.
never ends. Yeah, it's almost like for a lot of people, I feel like it can become an ego identity.
Yes, dude.
Like,
Yes.
I'm a plant medicine person, and so even if there's no like big benefit, it's become an identity too, which is, yeah, that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah, but I think it's an important thing to talk about because a lot of times interspiritual circles or people that are pursuing this route, you know, or this route is pursuing them, however you want to
Mm.
say it, plant medicine seems to have some place in it, or people are at least open to it.
Mm.
Um, and so I think that with all of this that's happening right now, it is important conversation because it's become a substitute for real transcendence. Um, my experiences, psychedelics, or even just plant medicine in general, and what was happening for a while. Um, I was working on a project with a friend, invited to do some things with cannabis, and after walking down that road, pretty much this whole past year of 2022, it became very evident and clear to me that we've mixed up the stream for the source,
Mm.
and that it's something that can lead us to that awakening, but it is not itself the awakening.
Yeah,
And I love your story because it opened you up, and so it did
exactly.
its job. It opened you up. But people get stuck in these loops now of, oh, I have to have that to open up. Um,
Mm.
did you feel at all that that was a temptation for a period of time where you were pursuing that as the avenue?
Yeah. Um, I think it's. Have you read "Be Here Now"?
Yes.
I'm assuming you're familiar with. Yeah. So his story, Ram Dass's story, I feel like when I read that, it really resonated with me because he talked about always wanting to get that high again, but he'd always come down. I'm not going to proclaim that I am always at that level of bliss. I'm definitely not, but I, yeah, I was, especially around the age of like 19 or 20. I didn't realize it. Actually, probably around like 18 or so. I didn't realize it, but I was spiritually seeking something, and was using mushrooms and LSD to try to reach what it was.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I did think that if I just kept exploring it, like doing it more and more, that I would develop more and more understanding. But what I understood was that I wasn't. I wasn't developing like, oh, like this time and now I have this deeper understanding of who I am and what the world is. It would be supportive for mood, which is a whole nother conversation. I'm a big advocate. I think the idea of microdosing for like mental health purposes
Yeah.
is great, but um, I did basically. You asked it, was it tempting? I think I did explore using it more and more, and what I found was that it wasn't helping me develop new insights,
Mm-hmm.
and that is what led me to realize, okay, like this, and more than that, I think it was actually kind of harming my mental health. I think that's another part of the conversation that people don't have who are really into plant medicine is how, like, if you keep doing these things over and over, there is an impact on your brain.
Totally.
So
Yes.
around that around that time when I was like 20, that's when I really started to focus on meditation, because I was like, this isn't good for me. I'm not developing new insights, and completely stopped. Like, I hadn't had any plant medicine experience until really like a year ago, when I started, like, occasionally I used mushrooms again, and it was nice, but it wasn't, anything crazy. So that was kind of how I approached the temptation, I guess.
So when you uh, had the revisitation of the psychedelics after this spiritual development, because I didn't have
Hmm.
any psychedelic experience until I think I was, what, 31 years old. I'm 33
Okay.
now. And so it was much later in the game from a lot of my friends. Um, then on the other side too, some people are still late. Like my friend that invited me into it wasn't 40 in his 40s until it happened. Um,
Hmm.
so I think my initial experience, I've only had three trips, and they've all been significant and meaningful. And I think it's because I've had developed a ritual practice in my life and have some level of framework for non-dualism before that ever
Hmm.
even entered into my experiences. So when you revisited that last year, how was that different from maybe some of the earlier times of your experiences?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what it was for me was a reminder, of that experiential understanding of non-duality, which I can get there for sure through my meditation practices. But what was nice about it for me was it just kind of really opened me up to that understanding beyond thought. So it was really like a reminder of that non-dual understanding that I had developed, but it was really like experiential reminding.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I feel like with my own spiritual path over the past 8 to 10 years, it's been so intellectual,
Mm.
and it's experiential too with my practices. But so much of it is like deeply studying, these traditions, different teachers, different philosophies, and that's really helpful. But I think the reintegration of mushrooms over the past year just kind of helped me get out of my head and to like really feel it. And also a big part of that experiential knowing was love.
Mm.
It was really beautiful. It just really showed me that, like, that's all that matters really. I had a specific moment where I was really just meditating, but not in the like one pointed type of meditation where I was trying to focus on my breath really intensely. I was just being open to the present moment.
Yeah.
And what I kept noticing was whenever I tried to think, I didn't feel love. But whenever I allowed myself just to be, and this is when I was on mushrooms, I experienced love, and it was this like remembering that this is who I was, this is who I am,
Yeah.
and this is what matters, really. So yeah, that's kind of what it was like for me when I, reintroduced them. And yeah, it was really beautiful, honestly,
Were you with some people or were you by yourself? Like, what was the
by
context?
myself.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I would do it in a like a situation where everyone was setting an intention and it was very calm and everyone was going through some sort of like ceremony together. But personally, I like to kind of have my spirituality be like very just
Hmm.
by myself.
Yeah.
Unless I'm out like doing some work, helping service based stuff. But yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. It's because I know a lot of it too it's become a just like a whole culture, and it has been a culture already. But what I like about that as well is that it's not like you were trying to show anybody anything or prove like it's
Hmm.
like this is deeply for me, and I think that's what separates. Maybe not. It's not a good word, but I think what separates people who are really seeking for real true understanding of realization and connection from people who are just trying to, have something to make them feel good or know that they're okay and
Hmm.
all of that's okay. I don't want to sound dogmatic in any way. Like whatever reason is in someone to activate them towards growth and seeking is I think good and is used. Nothing is wasted. Everything's recycled.
Hmm.
But I do think that in this present era that we're in, like it's either the escapism or the trying to be. It's cultural. It's cool now to like,
Hmm.
do like again. We're both in San Diego. Like there's like stuff all over the place. All it's trendy. It's trendy.
It
That's what I'm
is,
looking
yeah.
for. And there's a difference between trendy and there's a difference between like you really understand that this is not just like far out ideas on a YouTube channel. Like this is the
Mhm.
nature of reality that we are understanding to be true. And
Yeah,
psychedelics can help that bring some real context to that, but it isn't just that. And so I love that
yeah.
your reintroduction was like, no, this was ceremonial, but for me. not
Hmm.
not like because I was invited to something in OB or whatever, like.
Yeah.
And no offense, again, I don't want to sound dogmatic. No offense if that's
No, no,
what
no. I
was
get what
your,
you're saying. Like, I
yes,
think it's important to point that out because there is, I think, danger in it being a trend, and I think people should speak. I think that should be a conversation people have because um, I do think that they're to be respected for what they are, and also um, they might not be for everyone. And so just because it's a trend and like a lot of people, it looks spiritual to go to this event or this ceremony, or you might be struggling with, some mental health thing, it doesn't mean that you should do like take plant medicine that you should use that. Like maybe it could help you, but it might not too. And so I think pointing out that just because something's trendy doesn't mean it's for everyone is important.
yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
Because that typically is the thing. Whatever becomes the trend becomes and that's at the end of the day, we're all looking for some level of savior, right? Like
Hmm.
something that's going to come and help, you know, mess me, fix where all I messed up and whatever. And we just are looking for
Yeah.
that savior idea. And, uh, you know, we just get it mixed up with all the stuff. But come back to, I mean, it's interesting how the conversation, I mean, 'cause that's a part of your story too, of interspirituality. It sounds like that opened you up to that. Um,
Hmm.
and then the reintroduction of that. Uh, but I'm curious because you do one-on-one spiritual direction, spiritual coaching. I'm not sure what language you use for that. Um,
Hmm.
and everybody's different, but is there some like basic sort of things without maybe giving away sort of your secret sauce, but like, are there some
No.
basics that you could impart to people who are maybe on this path and for whatever reason we had the conversation that went in the way it did. Apparently someone listening is, needing to navigate through some of that psychedelic conversation. Um,
Hmm.
Something that you impart to people from an interspiritual perspective as they're stepping into this path and it's maybe new or fresh or they're trying to find their way.
Yeah. Like, are you saying if someone had an experience with mushrooms or something and they're trying to integrate it, or are you saying just in general with like exploring an interspiritual life kind of?
Yeah, I think more so like if people are entering into that space of non-duality and
Okay.
they begin working with you, uh, on a one-on-one setting, just some fundamentals and some basics as you begin to welcome them onto the path, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. So, um, like what I would, if I was working with someone in a coaching format, um, usually what I would try to do is to just get to know the person. And I think everyone's different. So I don't think there's one set formula for every person. But I think the key really is like starting to develop spiritual practices that are tested, that have been around for a long time, understanding like the context of the practice too. So if we're practicing like mindfulness, for instance, how does that relate to the Buddhist philosophy
Mm-hmm.
of impermanence of the self? Because that's a different philosophy than the like Hindu philosophies in, you know, like the yogic tradition, where the self is permanent, the self is all it is. In the Buddhist tradition, the self doesn't exist and everything is impermanent. So kind of like understanding those practices within the context of their tradition. But then I would also say, to me, the most important thing is what your own experience is.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're practicing mindfulness and that's helping you with your reactivity, your stress, it's helping you to connect with who you are beyond thought, then that is a good enough reason to just keep doing it, and you don't have to get super caught up in what the philosophical understanding of the practice is from the Buddhist tradition. And then same thing, like if you're doing breath work or pranayama or prayer, you know, understanding like maybe from the yogic perspective, from the Christian perspective, um, some stuff about that, but then just kind of like seeing where that takes you.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I approach, I do like, I would say it's, you know, spiritual coaching, holistic coaching, and I don't take the approach of having answers, because I do feel like everyone comes to answers in their own way. If you want to have a guru, like that's fine. There's a place, I think, for having the spiritual teacher, but for me, it's just about helping people like learn some time tested practices, talk through what those experiences are like, how it helps that person in their life. And, you know, just really, my thing is, I think a lot of people need those direct experiences in their life, really like mystical experiences. And traditional modalities, I don't think a lot of times address that. Like
Mm-hmm.
traditional talk therapy is awesome for a lot of things, but from my experience, it's not really super supportive in helping people develop mystical experiences in their own way. And for me, that was a huge big shift in my life when I had those first mystical experiences. Everything in my life changed. Like my perspective on myself, my perspective on the world, my perspective on relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So my whole thing is like just helping people develop those practices that can help them experience that for themselves,
Yeah.
and you know, integrating that spiritual perspective in our daily life.
So a lot of you'd recommend like breath work, obviously, meditation, prayer, things of
Yeah.
that to help people get into. Because as I've been doing more spiritual direction and companioning, that's I'm with you on that. A lot of people want to know like, what's the first thing do I need to read? And it's like that's important. Don't get me wrong, but
Mhm.
it's also what's the first thing that you need to do tomorrow morning that you don't even need to read anything. You know, like how do you engage that? And with that as well as where, you know, I want to respect your time and things. From your Instagram, there's a few things I wanted to mention about that I think probably just display your overall philosophy, but you've been emphasizing prayer as well as meditation. And so as you're
Mhm.
advising people and walking people through integrating these practices, can you talk to me about your understanding of prayer and how that's developed and how you impart that to others?
Yeah. That's a good question that I'm always exploring myself. But the way I see prayer now is I kind of see different types of prayer existing at the same time. I think there's, like the communal form of prayer where we're literally just speaking to God. I've been doing that since I was like 3, I think. And to me, that's just a great way of developing a relationship with God. It's more dualistic, which is fine. Like, we can have a dualistic relationship. To me, I believe we can have a dualistic relationship with God while having a non dual understanding as well.
Yeah.
So there's, I would say, like, just take that traditional Christian perspective of communal prayer and introduce it into your life and see what comes from it. Just talk to God, express what you're feeling. What are you struggling with? What are you thankful for? Ask for help. Give a sense of gratitude. I just find that to be really transformative, spiritually, in a way that's different from meditation, because it really, to me, opens up the person energetically, and that shift in energy connects the person to, like, to God, really, or to who they are beyond their thoughts. So really, to me, the way I view communal prayer is it's really like energetic alchemy in a way. We're just working with energies through conversation.
Mm-hmm.
The other form of prayer is, to me, like in the Hindu tradition, the yogic tradition, if you're doing like mantra work, you're saying a mantra. Like, if I do Om is a big part of my practice. And when I do Om in the Yoga Sutras, they talk about contemplating the meaning of Om. And in the tradition, it's referred to as Ishvara. Like, Ishvara is kind of God, and Om is thought to be an actual manifestation of Ishvara.
Mm-hmm.
And so repeating Om, for me, like, I'll think about that beforehand. I'll think this term Om is God. So when I'm repeating Om, God is here with me. And then I'll try to feel Om as all of life, myself, everything around me is this energy of Om, which is God. So to me, that's another form of prayer. It's more kind of like a meditative form of prayer, I guess. But I still view that as prayer because it's not as simple as just listening to the sound of Om, which would be more of a traditional meditation where you're just focusing on the sound.
Mm-hmm.
I focus on cultivating the energy first of what Om means, and maintaining that energy and focusing on that energy while I repeat Om.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that same thing could be done with different words, whatever tradition someone's into. But those are the two different ways that I view prayer. And, traditional meditation is more, to me, focusing on one thing without generating much emotion about it. Like, you're focusing just on the breath. You're not thinking about what the meaning of the breath is.
Mm-hmm.
You're not trying to cultivate a feeling. Same thing if you're just, like I said, with Om. In the other way, if you're just listening to the sound Om, it can take you to the same place, but it's a different type of practice.
Yeah.
That's the way
And
I view it. Yeah.
in meditation, then, because like almost I see, because I grew up with prayer, and then meditation was like, evil, because it's
Mm-hmm.
not Christian, even though
Yeah.
it just goes to show how linear that was. But um, thinking about meditating on like the ajna energy center, the third eye, the thing that everybody talks about,
Mm-hmm.
awakening. Um, that almost feels like a unique hybrid of meditation prayer.
Yeah.
How would you classify that? Because I have a good decent understanding of some of the Hindu philosophy. I read the Gita, but I'm
Yeah.
curious from your perspective of that, like, because it's weird for me to think about, like you said, meditating is I'm opening up to the presence of awareness that is here without much focused intention or allocating energy in a particular way. But
Mm-hmm.
this is about allocating energy to that
Mm-hmm.
area. And so, just some of the ajna meditation.
Yeah. Well, I think like um, when it comes to like meditating with specific chakras, there's so many different ways people do it and teach it. So I feel like it's hard to give one conclusive answer on that. But from my understanding, yeah, usually I would say what you're saying about it being a combination of prayer and meditation is accurate. I think it's kind of similar to what we're doing, what I was saying with Om when I'm trying to cultivate the energy of Om and feel the energy of Om while I repeat it. A lot of times with chakra meditations, we're trying to cultivate the energy of that specific energy center, and we're focusing our attention on that energy to a certain extent. And then a lot of times with chakra meditation, people are working with the energy within the spinal system, so like kundalini type stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be maybe repeating a specific sound that's associated with that chakra. But I would say that, yeah, I agree that it's kind of like a combination because it's not as simple as just like looking at the third eye without doing anything else. There's a focus on generating kind of an energetic and emotional quality too.
Mm-hmm. How important is it to cultivate? Because I pray through my chakras. I've been doing that as a practice every day for a couple of years now.
Mm.
And I noticed too, just again with the trend of things and the eye. Um, I have a friend. I won't name him, but he he didn't know any of the other chakras. He's just like, oh, your ajna, your third eye, and I'm like, dude, like, you can't just skip, But I mean, but you can, but you can't,
You
but you.
can. I just don't know what the results would be. I don't know.
I don't even know that. And I just recorded a random YouTube video today just about how like the heart is everything is that's what hinges from the lower to the upper, right? And it's like without the heart and without the throat, like what do you even do if that begins to open? You know what I'm like?
Yeah.
There's a reason that it is and I love how Yogananda talks about it. The way that he describes it as a science, I think, is accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, yeah, like there is a level of formation to that point. How important is it for people to learn to develop working with the other chakra points before just jumping to trying to awaken their third eye because they see Instagram videos about that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, my personal take on that is that there needs to always be balance when we're working with like energy. And I do think that people who are so like strict when it comes to the dogma of the traditions and lineages and stuff will say, oh, like you should never work with, Kundalini related yoga stuff unless you have a master guru who can walk you through everything. And the point with people saying that is that when we're working with like energy in that way up and down the spine, it can be dangerous for sure. Like, because if anyone, I'm sure you've experienced this, like you can experience firsthand how it impacts our state of being. So I think what my teachers have told me when I've done different trainings and yoga teacher training, is that always like if we're doing breathwork practices, meditation practices that are more activating for those like higher centers, or if we're doing something with the third eye and we start to feel maybe a little erratic, or we notice our energy being all over the place like throughout our day, that's when it's important to also balance it with practices that calm us down.
Mm-hmm.
So breathwork practices that are about calming the nervous system down instead of activating the nervous system down. You're talking about trends. A big trend I think that I see in San Diego and a lot of New Age spirituality is just focusing on these breathwork practices that are super activating. But then there's never really a focus on breathwork practices that help calm down at all.
Right.
And I think that can be the danger of focusing on just like the higher chakra stuff without the lower stuff is it can be too activating, and it can be, I think, kind of risky for people's mental health, honestly, if there's not like a balance between some of the other stuff. But the whole conversation around like what specific stuff to do, it's so confusing and it's so complex because there's a million different thoughts on
Yeah.
what you should be practicing and all that. I know a lot of people would disagree with this, but my thing is like listen to your intuition and listen to teachers too, but also listen to your intuition. It's like if something feels like it's just helping you open your heart and you're feeling like a more loving person, I don't see any reason to change it. But if, there's some other side effects, then that's when I think it's important to look at what other teachers who focus on that type of stuff say about what you should be doing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really good. And I mean, intuition is so much. And even as we come to a close, I think that's true, is that even as, the listener, you hear, two people talk about these things, check in with
Yeah.
yourself. And I just posted I actually had this video on my phone forever. It came up. I was like, oh, I never shared that on Instagram. I should, but it's like Jesus says that, which is my guru, that the spirit of truth will lead you into all truth. And we have to remember that the kingdom of God is within us. And so it's the spirit within us will lead us on the path of righteousness. And everything else just helps us go there. So listeners, you listen to us, maybe hopefully, pick and pull some things and invite some ideas and thoughts. And ultimately it is about the intuition, and follow that and intuitively, sense what spirit is doing within, because that's what's always going to be faithful,
Totally.
So any, maybe, last words or thoughts on that you wanted to share, and then also how people can get in touch with you and what you offer for what you do.
Yeah. I mean, I think I totally agree with that on intuition. I think that there's a lot of people that I respect who disagree, who view it as, view it really to be important to follow a specific tradition and trust that they've understood what you should be doing. And I think there should be a balance between those things. But we should never disregard our intuition because someone tells us to. If we really feel internally that something feels off or something feels right, I wholeheartedly believe that we should be listening to that. And that's never let me down in my life. So I trust that more than I think anything, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, in terms of like where people can connect with me, where people can, work with me and stuff, I'm on Instagram at Spirit of Ellis, and I'm mainly consider myself a spiritual creator, and I call myself a spiritual change maker. So I offer different things. I do, like we were talking about earlier, I do a form of holistic coaching for people who, want to take more of like a spiritual approach to working through their life's challenges. And then I also offer marketing coaching and consulting for people who own spiritual businesses. So that's a big goal for me, is I realize with my own content creation that so many people out there have these amazing spiritual messages and are amazing spiritual businesses and projects, but they don't know how to like get themselves out there. A big part of my background is working in marketing, and that to me, as of late, has been a big goal, is to try to help people who have these spiritual messages and businesses get their stuff out there.
Mm.
So that's another thing that I offer is marketing, specifically helping people with social media and content. Yeah, those are probably the best ways to get in contact with me, and in
Sweet.
terms of offerings, best offerings. Yeah.
And you have a podcast as well, right?
Yes, I have a podcast. It's funny that you're also going through kind of a transformation with yours in the name and stuff. Mine also is going through a transformation right now. So the best way to get in touch with the podcast would probably be just to follow me on Instagram at Spirit of Ellis, and you can see the link there.
Cool. Awesome. Ellis, thank you so much. And if you don't mind, hang on for a second. I have a couple other just things
Yeah.
offline for you. And but I appreciate you carving out an hour of your day and sharing the wisdom.
Yeah, my pleasure, Luke.